It began like any other summer evening, the kind where the sun hangs low in the sky, painting the streets of Buffalo, New York in warm golden hues. A quiet neighborhood, the kind where children ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on. Parents call their kids home for dinner, doors lock for the night, a sense of normalcy, of safety. But on one August evening in 2020, normalcy shattered. Jaylen Griffin was just 12 years old, a boy with a bright smile, an ordinary child with ordinary dreams. On that night, he stepped out of his home. Maybe he was going to meet someone. Maybe he was just out for a short walk. Maybe he expected to be back before anyone even noticed he was gone. But Jaylen never came back. At first, no one panicked. Maybe he was at a friend's house. Maybe he lost track of time. The minutes stretched into an hour. Then another. His mother called his name, expecting him to come running through the door, full of excuses about where he had been. But there was no answer. The streets that had always felt familiar suddenly became ominous. Every shadow, every parked car, every stranger passing by, it all became something to fear. Jaylen's mother picked up the phone and dialed. First, she called the people he knew, friends, neighbors. No one had seen him, no one knew where he was. Then she called the police. A missing child. How quickly those words change everything. At first, the question seemed routine. Was he prone to wandering? Had he ever run away before? Did he have a history of sneaking out? Every question implied the same thing, that maybe, just maybe, Jaylen had done this to himself. That this was something normal, something that would resolve itself in a matter of hours. But his mother knew better. She knew her son. He wouldn't just disappear without a word. And as the night stretched on, as the hours passed with no sign of Jaylen, fear turned into something deeper, something worse. The police began their search, but there were no immediate leads. No surveillance footage showing which direction he went. No known conflicts, no clear reason why he would leave and never return. It was as if Jaylen had simply vanished. And somewhere, in the quiet of that summer night, a mother sat awake, staring at the door, waiting for her son to come home. But he never would. The first night was unbearable. Jaylen's mother barely slept, her body refusing to rest while her mind raced with every terrifying possibility. She sat by the window, hoping, praying, that at any moment he would come walking up the street, tired but safe. Maybe he had fallen asleep at a friend's house. Maybe his phone had died and he lost track of time. Maybe, just maybe, this was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew. By the time the sun rose, exhaustion mixed with dread. The police had filed the missing persons report, but no immediate action had been taken. A runaway, they said. A child who would likely return on his own. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't an emergency. Not yet. But to a mother, every second was an emergency. She called more people, family, friends, neighbors. She knocked on doors, asking the same desperate question. Have you seen Jaylen? No one had. The search began immediately. Volunteers gathered, walking through the streets, calling his name. Flyers were printed, his young face staring back in black and white, the words "missing child" bold across the top. Social media posts flooded timelines, desperate pleas for any information. But there was nothing. No witnesses, no camera footage, no messages from Jaylen himself. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The police asked more questions. Did he have any enemies? Had he ever talked about leaving? Could someone have hurt him? His mother answered each one with certainty. No, no, no. And yet, a terrible thought settled deep in her chest. Someone had taken him. The idea was too horrifying to fully accept, but as the hours turned into days, the evidence, or lack of it, became undeniable. A 12-year-old child does not simply disappear into thin air. Someone knew something, someone had seen something, but no one was talking. As days passed, panic turned into helplessness. The world kept moving, people continued with their lives, but for one mother, time had stopped. Every night, she left the porch light on. Every night, she sat by the window, watching, hoping. But Jaylen never walked through the door. And as the days stretched into weeks, hope became something fragile, something that threatened to slip away entirely. Word spread quickly. A missing child, a frightened mother, a search with no direction. Buffalo had seen tragedies before, but this was different. This was a child, a boy who should have been home, playing video games or doing his homework. Not missing, not lost, not gone. People rallied together. Neighbors who had never spoken before now walked side by side, calling his name. Flyers covered telephone poles, store windows, church bulletin boards, anywhere they might catch an eye. Social media exploded with posts urging people to keep looking, to spread awareness. But awareness wasn't enough. The longer Jaylen remained missing, the louder the questions became. Had the police done enough? Was his case being treated with the urgency it deserved? Some whispered concerns that his disappearance wasn't getting the same attention as others. That if he had been someone else's child, things might have been different. Still, his family refused to let him become another forgotten name. They organized search parties, combing through abandoned buildings, wooded areas, anywhere a boy might hide or be hidden. They checked with hospitals, shelters, anywhere he could have turned up. Nothing. Tips trickled in, some more credible than others. Someone claimed to have seen him near a park. Another person swore they spotted him at a gas station. But every lead was a dead end. Each false sighting chipped away at the hope that had once felt unshakable. The days turned into weeks. The vigils began. Candlelight gatherings where people prayed for his safe return. His mother stood before crowds, her voice raw with exhaustion and pain, pleading for anyone to come forward with information. But as the weeks turned into months, the crowds grew smaller. The searches became less frequent. Other news stories took over, and the terrible reality settled in. Jaylen was still missing, and no one knew where he was. Time moved forward, but the case stood still. Leads dried up. The initial urgency of the investigation faded into quiet frustration. Detectives assigned to Jaylen's case followed every tip, every rumor, every fleeting piece of information that might point to his whereabouts. But no matter where they looked, they found nothing. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no messages, no clues. It was as if Jaylen Griffin had simply vanished. For his family, the silence was unbearable. The unanswered calls, the generic responses from authorities, the slow realization that without new evidence, the search would not and could not continue at full force. The questions from detectives became repetitive. Had Jaylen run away? Did he have a reason to leave? Was there something, anything that could explain his disappearance? Each time his mother gave the same answer. No. Jaylen wasn't a runaway. He was taken. But without proof, theories remained theories. The media, once invested in the story, began to move on. Other headlines took priority. Missing child cases, unless they had dramatic developments, rarely stayed in the news cycle for long. The family refused to let his name fade. They contacted journalists, spoke at community meetings, pushed for more media coverage. They created online pages dedicated to keeping his face in the public eye. Still, the investigation stalled. A case without evidence, a mystery without answers. And as months turned into years, the worst fear of all began to settle in. What if Jaylen Griffin was never coming home? The seasons changed. The years passed, and Jaylen Griffin remained missing. At first, the hope stayed strong. His mother still left the porch light on, still checked her phone every few minutes, waiting for a call that never came. The search team still gathered, volunteers still walked the streets, still knocked on doors, still asked the same question. Have you seen Jaylen? But the answer never changed. No. The missing posters faded, weathered by time, some peeling off the walls they once covered. People still shared his picture online, but less frequently. New stories took over. New faces appeared on missing persons lists, and Jaylen became another unsolved case. His mother refused to accept it. She still spoke his name at every opportunity, still called the police for updates, still begged for someone, anyone to come forward. But each time the response was the same. No new leads, no new information, no movement in the case. Detectives were reassigned. Files collected dust. The world moved on. False hope came in waves. Sightings that led nowhere. People who claimed to have information only to be proven wrong, or worse, to be lying for attention. And through it all, his mother was left with nothing but silence. The silence of a home missing a child. The silence of a community that had once rallied but had now grown quiet. The silence of a case that had no answers. 4 years. 4 birthdays passed with an empty chair at the table. 4 Christmases with unopened gifts. 4 years of waiting, of wondering, of fearing the worst but never truly knowing. And then in April 2024, the silence was shattered. Because Jaylen Griffin had finally been found. But it wasn't the homecoming his mother had prayed for. April 2024. A phone call. A moment frozen in time. A mother's worst nightmare confirmed. For 4 years, Jaylen Griffin had been missing. His face had faded from headlines, his case had grown cold, and his family had been left with nothing but unanswered questions. And then, out of nowhere, a breakthrough. Human remains had been found in Buffalo, a discovery that sent a ripple of dread through those who had never stopped searching for Jaylen. The police conducted tests, and soon there was no more doubt. It was him. Jaylen Griffin was dead. The weight of those words crushed everything in their path. His mother, who had fought so hard to keep hope alive, was now forced to accept the one truth she had prayed never to hear. The boy she had waited for, cried for, begged to return, he was never coming home. But the discovery answered only one question. Where was Jaylen? It did nothing to explain how he had died, or who was responsible, or why. The police reopened their investigation, shifting from a missing persons case to something darker. A crime scene was examined, evidence was collected. The same questions that had gone unanswered for 4 years were now being asked again. But this time, there was no hope of finding Jaylen alive. There was only the search for justice, and the terrifying realization that someone, somewhere, knew the truth about what had happened to him, and had been hiding it all along. The discovery of Jaylen Griffin's remains should have brought closure. Instead, it brought more questions. Where had he been for the past 4 years? Had he died recently, or had his life been taken the very night he disappeared? Was his body hidden all this time, waiting to be found? Or had someone placed him there, knowing that eventually the truth would surface? The police called it an open investigation. But what did that really mean? Had they found signs of foul play? Were they searching for a suspect? Or was this just another case that would be filed away, waiting for a lead that might never come? His family needed answers. They demanded to know what had happened to their child, who had stolen his future, and why it had taken so long to find him. But the authorities remained tight-lipped, releasing only what they had to. Official statements, carefully worded press conferences, promises that they were following every lead. But were they? Or was this just another case that would fade into the background? The community, once united in the search for Jaylen, was divided. Some believed justice was coming, that someone would be held accountable. Others weren't so sure. 4 years had passed. 4 years where the truth had remained buried. 4 years where someone, perhaps multiple people, had kept their silence. And whoever they were still out there, watching, waiting, hoping that once again, the world would move on. The news of Jaylen's discovery sent shockwaves through Buffalo, but for his mother, it was a pain beyond words. For 4 years she had lived in uncertainty, trapped in the agonizing limbo between hope and despair. She had prayed for his return, fought for answers, refused to let his name be forgotten, and now the answer had come, but it was the one she had feared the most. Jaylen was gone, not missing, not waiting to be found, not somewhere out there needing help, gone. The grief hit in ways she never expected. It wasn't just sadness, it was rage, it was helplessness. It was the unbearable weight of knowing her child had suffered and that someone had kept the truth hidden for years. She thought of his last moments. Had he been scared? Had he called out for her? Had he been alone? The thoughts haunted her, playing over and over like a cruel, never-ending loop. And then came the next, even more painful realization. There was no one to blame. No suspect, no arrest, no justice, just a boy's remains, found years too late. Funeral arrangements had to be made. A service planned. But how do you say goodbye to a child who never should have been taken from you? How do you grieve when the world still doesn't know the truth? People offered condolences. Strangers sent flowers. There were news articles, interviews, promises that his death wouldn't be in vain. But none of it changed the reality. A mother had lost her son, and she might never know why. Grief could have broken her. It could have left her silent, drained of all strength. But Jaylen's mother refused to let his name become just another statistic, another cold case buried beneath years of neglect. If the police weren't going to bring answers fast enough, she would demand them. She spoke at vigils, at press conferences, in front of cameras. She didn't beg for justice. She demanded it. Demanded that the police work harder. demanded that the media keep his story alive, demanded that the city of Buffalo not let this case slip away like so many others. Community activists rallied behind her. People who had never met Jaylen marched in his name. Social media reignited with hashtags calling for answers. But still there was silence from those who knew the truth. Because someone knew. Someone knew where Jaylen had been. Someone knew how his life had ended. Someone had lived the past 4 years carrying a secret too dark to speak aloud. And yet, they stayed hidden. Were they afraid, or were they confident that time had protected them? That after 4 years, the world would move on once again? Jaylen's mother refused to let that happen. If the system failed her son, she would not go quietly, because someone knew what had happened to Jaylen Griffin. And one day the truth would come out. Time had stolen so much. 4 years of questions, 4 years of silence, 4 years of waiting for a boy who would never come home. But time would not steal justice. Jaylen Griffin's case was not over. His mother would not let it be over. The community would not let it be over. His story would not be buried with him. Somewhere, out there, the truth still existed. Someone had the answers. Someone knew the final moments of Jaylen's life. And as long as there were voices demanding justice, those answers would come to light. This story is not just about tragedy. It is about accountability, about a family's refusal to be ignored, about a fight that isn't over. Jaylen Griffin's name will not fade. And if you believe that justice should be served, that no child's disappearance should go unanswered, then help keep this case alive. Subscribe for more stories that demand the truth, that uncover the forgotten, that refuse to let injustice be swept away. Because Jaylen's story isn't over. And until justice is served, we cannot look away.